Hey everyone. Well, Trudeau is busy out there setting records. And no, not the one that we're familiar with, which is him going around constantly making a fool out of himself and Canada. That is a record all on its own and makes me ashamed to even say that I'm Canadian. But no, that's quite minor in comparison to this record breaking fact. Listen to this headline of the Financial Post. And for you younger people, millennials in particular, yeah, this burden is going to be resting squarely on your shoulders. Or actually, I should include Gen Z at this point, because at these levels, it's definitely going to take multiple generations to pay for Trudeau's reckless spending spree. That's the problem with socialism. Governments can economically enslave seemingly as many generations as they want, as long as the people continue to vote for it. And as you see, the Canadian people are definitely in the mood to vote for this stuff. Headline: Trudeau government has pushed federal spending to the highest level in Canadian history. Let me read that one more time so it really sinks in. Trudeau government has pushed federal spending to the highest level in Canadian history. In other words, for as long as this country has been a country, no prime minister in the past has ever ramped up spending to the levels that the Trudeau government has done. And keep in mind, Canada was part of World War I and World War II. And this is all being done when we're supposed to be doing great, right? That's the message we're constantly being told by our thought leaders or so-called experts in terms of economics. Like, come on, please, that's a joke all on its own. But think about the message they constantly tell you. Oh, we're doing great. We're doing better than most of the G7 countries and all that. Well, then what's the point when you're doing great and being so reckless in your spending of other people's money, in particular the youth or the unborn who have no say in this matter and will be straddled with and burdened with these debt levels? Well, that is, if they're foolish enough to pay for them. Opinion: research indicates the optimal size of government is much smaller than what currently exists. Gee, no shit, Dick Tracy, right? Way, way, way smaller. This is a special to the Financial Post contributed by Tegan Hill and Jake Fuss, January 15th, 2020. Sound fiscal policy is crucial for a healthy economy. A key component of sound policy is the appropriate size and role of government, i.e., government spending and regulations. Higher spending comes at the expense of higher taxes, levied now or in the future through larger deficits and greater debt accumulation, all of which can influence economic growth and social progress. The issue is particularly relevant today as 2019 marks the highest level of federal government spending in Canadian history. Certainly the government has an important role to play. Public services are critical for a well-functioning economy, but what's the right size of government? So I just want to say before I continue on, as a libertarian, all these policy decision and how government needs to be in charge of these social programs or necessary services, it's all a complete fabrication. It's all built on lies and an unfounded belief in central planning and governance. These people seemingly don't know how to think outside their narrow little tunnel vision or bubbles. Some great minds have already figured out and pointed out that no, we don't need government for about 99% of the things it's used for. Because what is government at the end of the day? Think about it. It's a representation of a monopoly of force or violence. And reality suggests that in most social or economic situations, you don't need to use force or threats thereof in most exchanges. Now, if you want to bicker with the minarchists in terms of, oh, we really, really need the state for defense, to protect the country, to protect the state, because that's, everyone believes that we live in a state, so we live in a state, right? Until you convince other people that they don't live in a state and they're autonomous, sovereign individuals, well, you're always going to have a state. So let's just function with the reality that exists. And that reality suggests that we need government. Well, what do you need government for? If it is considered a monopoly of force or violence, when would you ever need that? Obviously, to be the final arbiter of disputes, aka the legal or court system, or to defend the country in terms of the military, right? Even that, I would suggest, can be done just like the US when they set up the militias without big government and central planning. But hey, I get it. People want to argue and bicker back and forth about the role of government in terms of defending the country. That's an area, like I say, we're not even anywhere close to the point where we're arguing over that small minor aspect. We're talking about today where the government represents the largest percentage of all economic transactions, which was covered in another article, and I'll share that in this video as well. I mean, basically the government now represents more in terms of economics, which once again is all done by way of force or compulsion, than anything that happens in the private sector. That gradual creep over the last 4 or 5 decades has brought us to this point where we're now so close, so on the precipice of being fully socialist as a country, that I don't know how much longer it's going to be before we reach that point. But that pace has been definitely ramped up under the Trudeau Liberals. The question ultimately comes down to what share of resources are best kept by workers, entrepreneurs, and businesses that create them, versus the share of resources the government should extract to spend on the priorities it deems important. Two common measures are used to calculate the size of government: spending as a share of the economy and per person spending, adjusted for inflation. First, let's review spending as a share of the economy. According to the IMF's Fiscal Monitor, Canada's spending, including all levels of government as a share of the economy, is a little more than 40%, without accounting for regulations, which would increase the size of government further. And yeah, let me just show you this little chart. This one comes out of the Macdonald-Laurier Institute. And as you can see here, it's actually 44% of GDP. But if you include those regulations and other aspects not included in this particular number, you're looking at, you see, 64%. 64% of GDP if you include everything. Don't just cherry pick, but if you include it all, you're talking now almost 2/3 of the economy that's dictated by big government and central planning. A mounting body of research suggests this level of government spending is well above the level linked with maximizing economic growth and social well-being. Indeed, the evidence indicates that the optimal size of government for economic growth, including federal, provincial, and local, is between 26% and 30% of GDP. Beyond this level, economic growth rates begin to decline. When the share of spending exceeds 35% of GDP, not only is economic growth impaired, but improvement in social well-being indicators such as life expectancy and educational attainment are generally limited. But what about per person spending? A recent Fraser Institute study finds that the Trudeau government is now spending at the highest level in Canadian history, despite the absence of any major military conflict or recession. Indeed, the study, which calculates inflation-adjusted program spending, total federal spending minus interest costs on debt, for every year since 1870, finds that per person spending is expected to reach $9,066 in 2019. For context, per person spending, inflation adjusted, was $7,612 at its peak during the Second World War and $8,811 during the 2009 recession. Now, let me just say, I'm going to push back a little bit here in terms of this. When you try to spread out these numbers, it says, what, 9,000 per person? You know, that's not the case. You, as someone in the private sector, if you're healthy, you never use the healthcare system very much. You don't use many government services. You're not a parasite. The spending on you is minimal. I know for me, like basically nothing. Zilch. For how many years straight? I couldn't even begin to tell you, but basically nothing. So that 9,000 isn't going to me, which means those in the public sector, or the parasites in this country, which there are many, well, there's 4.1 million Canadians that work for all three levels of the government alone, right? And then think of all the crony corporations with all the bailout money, all the subsidies, and all the perks that come with cozying up to big government. I mean, sure, those guys, or those people, are making out like bandits. They're the ones seeing the largest share of that particular pie, which, once again, somebody's got to pay for it at some point in time. And since we all know that's not going to be paid off anytime soon, we all know who's going to be paying for that stuff. It's our kids, our grandkids, and ultimately might be our great-grandkids, which is so immoral, so disgusting, and so vile. I don't know how any Canadian could support it. And for what? More and more entitlements for the ruling class and their bureaucrats, along with that gigantic public sector and their unions? And let's not forget about those entitled teachers who are clamoring for an even larger share of that pie in the age of information of all times. These people really are so out of touch, it's almost unbelievable. Of course, Canadians must consider what they gain from this unprecedented level of spending. According to the Bank of Canada, Canada's economic outlook is quite weak. Recent projections estimate economic growth of only 1.5% in 2019. There are other worrying signs too, including dismal employment numbers and weak business investment. Social indicators also show little progress despite higher spending. For example, according to PISA, the OECD's International Assessment of Student Performance, our students' performance in reading, math, and scientific literacy has either declined or remained largely unchanged in recent years, despite an increase in nominal spending on K-12 public education of 10.7% over the past 5 years, with 2016-2017 the latest year of available data. Similarly, healthcare wait times, a useful measure of the efficiency of Canada's healthcare system, show a median wait time of 20.9 weeks for medical necessary treatment this year, the second longest wait time recorded in more than 2 decades, despite a 15% increase in nominal health spending over the past 5 years. Clearly, bigger government doesn't necessarily mean better government. Canadians should be aware of the appropriate size and role of government. The research indicates the optimal size of government, one that maximizes economic growth and social progress, is much smaller than what currently exists. So there you have it, folks. An excellent article. Now, I would say I would push much, much harder on this whole thing in terms of the size of government, like 28% or 30%. Like that. Listen, you don't need government that big, but hey, at the very least, I will agree that government is much, much too big now and encroaching on so much private development, private enterprise, and entrepreneurship that, yes, it is greatly degrading and destroying the potential for economic prosperity in this country. The old people, in particular the boomers, they're going to want to keep this stuff going on because right now, the status quo, the establishment, the way the system is set up, it's greatly benefited them and has been doing so for decades, and they want that to continue on further. This ramp up for mass immigration and this constant stimulating of the economy is to pay for the unfunded liabilities and entitlements of that big, gigantic cohort of boomers who are moving off into retirement and will be for the next 10 years or so. And as you can see, Canadians voted for this stuff. They basically told us all, us from generations on down, is screw you. We're getting ours. You're paying for it. And if you don't pay for it, well, we've got redundancy built in to the tune of millions of immigrants that they're bringing to this country, which is going to have another massive negative ramification for not just the economy, but the culture of this country going forward as well. Although at this point in time, I don't know how it could get much worse in terms of the culture. The private sector, the working class, the average man, woman, and child in this country are basically living as modern day serfs or indentured servants anyways. But I guess, yeah, no, I shouldn't say that things are the worst they could be, because things can definitely get worse. But I can say that it sure as heck don't look like Canadians are in any mood to change anything. The majority, or should I say the plurality, of people who chose to vote in this past election sent a real clear message. And that message is they like the status quo just the way it is, and they're hell-bent to keep it that way. It's Canadian Libertarian, and I love liberty.